Hello everyone, Stefan here again, and today I wanted to talk to you about one of my favorite RPGs of all time, a game that's actually on my top 25 games of all time, and one of my favorite games from the entire 5th generation on PS1, The Legend of Legaia. And this, for me, was a huge eye-opener, because back in the day, if you remember anything about my history as a gamer, the system that really turned me away from the PC and the Mac was the PS1. And that started a lot through Squaresoft games. When I first got the system, two of my first games were Bushido Blade and Final Fantasy VII. So I really went through a huge Squaresoft kick, buying like pretty much anything with the Squaresoft label on it. And majority of the time that was a great thing. They were just instant classics, but occasionally it was something I didn't enjoy. And looking back on it, for the first couple of years that I owned this PS1, I missed out on a lot of other good games because I was spending all the money I had on things that just said Squaresoft somewhere on the box. And one of the few games that was an exception to that was The Legend of Legaia, because it was something I got as a Christmas gift one year, and I really, really, really loved it. And it made me turn away from just being sort of that Squaresoft guy into someone who explored other things, and that's how I got into other series like Persona and stuff that became sort of like all-time favorites of mine, getting to Legend of Dragoon, buying other series away from the Squaresoft label that made me sort of just expand my horizons as a gamer. And I really credit this. It was something that it did open my eyes during that period. It's an amazing, amazing RPG that I absolutely fell in love with. It has an amazing soundtrack. For me, as it has the best ever fighting system for a turn-based RPG. Not talking about, action RPGs or anything like that, but for strictly turn-based RPGs, The Legend of Legaia has easily, by far, my favorite combat engine. It's this great system with arts where you have a certain number of AP points, and you can charge them up between different rounds, and you use them by hitting up, down, left, or right, and the different combinations act as, instead of picking up a specific move, you have to combine these different kicks and punches to create a chain that makes an art. So you would do, say, like up, up, down, left would activate a special attack, and you have to end up memorizing those, or you can always, there's always a little like cheat menu thing where you can check your arts during combat. But there's a great way of finding new arts through getting these new mystic scrolls, or being taught an art, or just finding them on the fly. One of the just most exciting things about it was just entering combat and just hitting random button combinations and finding an art early on in the game when you only start off with one or two. It has some incredibly memorable characters. Just Vaughn, Noah, and Gala were a fantastic trio. Especially Noah, I really, really loved her character. I loved her exuberance. She was kind of a Riku before Riku, but a little more innocent. And they're just really fun, memorable characters in a very colorful world that had an amazing soundtrack, a fantastic combat engine, and had this had a very classic feel to it. It's something that within minutes of starting the game, you already knew this is something that was going to stand the test of time. It was something that had that undefinable quality where not only is it good, but you can tell it's a classic. There's something to be said for the difference between a game that is really, really good in its time versus a game that's really, really good even 20 years after it came out. And this is one of those games that I really, really got into. It has a beautiful story. I love the Rosaru and all the different mythologies attached to it. And I love going through the whole world in the beginning is covered in this mist, and learning the mystery of what is this mist, what are the Seru and the Rosaru and all these different creatures, and finding these different worlds. And it's just a fun game, and the whole idea of exploring the mist and fighting back against the mist really added a sense of mystery and exploration into it had this very onward push throughout the entire game where you just wanted to keep going. You wanted to find the next tree and bring it back to life. You wanted to fight back against the mist. You wanted to find the next town, find these new characters. It's one of those things you never want to put down because it's so just forward moving. It has this great action-packed momentum to it, and just a sense of wonder. And that's something that I feel like is probably one of the hardest things to accomplish in a game, is creating a sense of wonder. You can put a lot of work into making something artistically creative. You can make it a very powerful technological achievement. You can make a big statement with the visuals and go overboard with maybe pushing like a message. But creating a sense of wonder is something that I feel comes from something that's artistically deeper within the creators that cannot necessarily be forced out, and something that just kind of happens or doesn't happen, no matter how much effort you put into it. And this is something that definitely achieved that sense of wonder and is one of my favorite games of all time. And going along with it, it actually has one of the best demos of all time, which is kind of an odd thing to say, but I love this demo of the game because it takes you through an alternate version of the opening hour or so of the game. It goes through the events of the opening of the game. It takes you through roughly until you leave the first town, but it does it where, as if the two characters that you don't meet, Noah and Gala, until later in the game, are already in the beginning town. And it's sort of an alternate reality, and it's very funny because it's very self-aware. Gala will say things like, now remember, as you're going to train with him on the beach, so now remember, in the full version of the game, I'm not going to know who you are, we're not going to be friends. And like Noah will mention it several times. There's always mentions of, now this is just the demo version of the game, so you can't do this yet, or I won't remember you when I meet you next time. It's very comical because it's very self-aware, and you meet these characters earlier than you should have, like earlier than you actually do in the real game, and it just makes for a very, very fun demo that I didn't get a chance to play until after I played the actual game, but I feel like even playing it beforehand would be a perfect way of making you want to purchase the game. And it's something where even if you are a big fan of the game and you haven't played this demo, check out the demo just because of that sense of humor. And it really, the fact that that really works and is a big plus really shows how one of the best things about the game, not just the story, not just the combat and the visuals and the music, but is the interaction between the three main characters. And I think that's why, for me, it's lasted so high on my list of favorite games for so many years, and has really stood up against games that are a much bigger budget from a much bigger team, definitely much bigger than like Contrail's team. This was just published by like Sony, and it's that relationship between those three characters, that to me is the core of this game. The way they interact with each other, the way their stories unfold, and the way that you get this sort of almost like a very just happy, joyful feeling from your interaction with them, and you feel close to them in a way where you really feel the pain of some of the later situations in the game. And that leads me to sort of a sad situation here with the sequel, Legaia 2 on PS2, which a lot of people don't even know exists because it sold very poorly. It sold under 100,000 copies. I'm pretty sure that's worldwide it sold under 100,000. It was made by a different company and published by a different company. It has very little relation. It has two of the original three musical composers and a couple other people, but otherwise it's very little to do with the team that created the first game, and it really shows. It does keep the same combat engine, which is great, and makes a few little tweaks that, depending on who you are, you might prefer the new style, you might prefer the old style. Personally, I prefer the old one. Luckily, though, the tweaks are small and doesn't change a whole lot, and a lot of the big changes have to do more with your accessories, items that you get that can affect certain things like creating infinite AP or different combat effects. There's much a bigger focus on crafting and obtaining and equipping items in this than just learning the arts. The first game focused more on all those hyper arts and mystic arts and all the combat arts and the combinations, and while this has this, that aspect is a little bit downplayed in favor of more of an accessory system, which I personally did not enjoy. I also feel like the story as a whole is probably just as good as the original story. I'd say they're kind of on par, but where it loses it a little bit is the main cast is not as memorable, they're not as enjoyable to travel with, and that's sort of where it falls apart. You have a great main story, but like I said, the first game, what was even better than the main story was the interaction of the cast and the connection you got with that main trio, and you don't have quite as much of a connection here. So it's kind of it's a little bit of a toss-up. I mean, this definitely for me is overall better. The first game is better than the second one story-wise, but I have to again say that with a little bit of like an annotation. The main overall plot is just as good in 2. You could even argue it's a little bit better. It's a little more of the world is doomed type. It's a little more generic, but in a more complex way. Like, it's very well told, but the characters just are not as memorable. And a big part of that too comes in the art style. It's not as colorful as the first game. It loses a lot of that, again, that sense of wonder, like I said, that just kind of happens. You can't really artificially produce that, and here they didn't. I mean, production values are up to par. The visuals are great. You don't have muddy textures, which you can get in a lot of early PS2 games. It definitely, it's great visually, but it doesn't have that super colorful, playful fantasy pop to it. It went for a little bit more of a darker toned, more, you could say, almost realistic brownish style. Has color, but not the almost oversaturated, overly bright style of the first game that actually really worked for the world they were trying to create. And here it seemed like they were trying to more compete directly with the other games of the time rather than just make something that is its own. And something like Legend of Legaia at the time could very much have fallen into the trap that many RPGs of the time did, where it was trying to compete directly with Final Fantasy VII, and this didn't do that. It just was its own thing. It came out, and it's like, this is what it is, and it's great. But Legaia 2 felt like it was trying a little too hard to fight the competition rather than be its own thing and let things just be what they are. Let things happen. It's successful, awesome. If it's not, it wasn't because we tried to emulate the competition and were worse. We were our own thing and it wasn't accepted. And that's kind of what happened with Legend of Legaia. It's definitely a superior game to the second one. It sold better, but it was far from a bestseller because it didn't stand out, because it wasn't trying to be like the bestsellers. It was its own thing, and is now sort of a hidden gem that people have gone back to. But not a lot of people have gone back to Legaia 2 for those same reasons. It tried to be the bestseller and it showed that it wasn't the same quality. If you try to mimic something and you're not as good, it shows. If you try to be your own thing and you just have lower production values, you can still be just as good in other areas and be an overall better product. So Legaia 2, a very good game that I enjoyed, and it's definitely a must-play if you play the first one, but this is something where, again, I wouldn't necessarily pick it up if you aren't a big fan of the first one. It doesn't follow the story directly at all. It takes place in the same world, but it's a completely unrelated story that in many ways could have been a completely unrelated game and not a 2, not a sequel. But it is a very great game to check out. Between the two, though, definitely go and pick up Legend of Legaia. This is a must-have, all-time classic. This is just a very good game, and that's sort of the difference between the two. This is something that has a lot of nostalgia for me. It has this magical sense of wonder that this is missing. This is a quality product, but again, it's more of a quality product than a wonderful experience. And that's kind of my take on these two games. Absolutely love them. Again, if you happen to run into the demo, check out the demo, whether you played the games or not. It's a great demo. I love the just whimsical fun of including the characters in the first part of the game that aren't originally there, and just sort of that breaking of the fourth wall, self-realization that this is just the demo. In the full game, things will be different. Absolutely love these games. Some of my favorites, a huge hidden gem, and again, even a hidden gem on the PS2. It's sold very, very poorly, and like I said, good game, just not as good as the first. Legend of Legaia, one of my favorite games of all time.